All right, there you go, sir. All ready.
Thanks, John. Can you hear me in the back? What the hell? Oh, you gotta be kidding me. We're not doing lip sync today, it's loudness. That's better. Many thanks to Martin Davies and Neil Howman for developing this worthwhile event and for inviting us to participate. I suspect that this year it's probably not snowing or sleeting, but not trusting London weather. I'm participating via this very nice and warm projector. I'm thinking of all of you, I promise, who must suffer through the next few minutes. Thankfully, the video is time constrained and will edit out all of my normal chatter and at least most of the bad jokes. As with opinions, artistic intent is going to vary with the person. Delivering programs the way a producer intends them to be heard may not always result in a consistent experience for the consumer. We know this. Variable playback environments can compound the issue, and the thought of delivering different versions of a program is daunting. But what can a producer do? For all the work that's gone into learning new metering techniques, there still often exists a final processor that's left to deal with all the content that doesn't play by the rules. And whilst at it, it deals with all of the correct content as well. So even though the pace is set for the worst content, the best content really takes a hit also. So the result might be pleasing to most of the audience and certainly to all the meters, but it's likely not very pleasing to anybody that's producing content. So loudness metering, we've heard a lot about this today. We're not going to rehash the obvious here, but it mimics human perception effectively enough. But by itself, it's not very intelligent. Loudness meters are good with averages. They're not fast. In fact, it might be that integration time is related to annoyance. For example, a loudness meter knows the difference between a part of the program that has intentional dynamics or loudness variations, as long as that integration time is fast enough. However, if you make it go too fast, we head back to VU meter ballistics. If you make it too slow, loudness events are averaged out. Think about this. Think about part of a program that is intentionally loud. A plane crashing into the side of a mountain. That's correct. Think about a very loud guitar solo after a quiet death scene. That's inappropriate. But a meter's not going to know the difference. So using BS 1770 for an overall average loudness measure enables scaling type systems to align content on average. So the averages of programs are matched. But with wide dynamic range content, it can result in dialogue loudnesses that don't match. So think about this. You have two different programs. You have measured and scaled them. On average, they match, but the dialogue loudness between them shifts as you transition from one program to another or from one television channel to another. Of course, using dialogue as an anchor for metering, either doing it manually, so starting and stopping the meter when there's dialogue, for live content, or using automated process for file-based content, it can improve the correlation between what the meter measures and what the viewer actually focuses on. But the result is still not perfect. Consumers are, in general, lazy, and content is absorbed more passively than actively. Basically, they don't like to be disturbed. They've got one hand in the bowl of crisps and the other holding a pint, and that leaves no hands for the remote. So if loudness is shifting, customers are getting frustrated, even if it's intentional loudness shifts. Analog delivery, with its requisite dynamic range processing, remember it was necessary to prevent taking up too much spectrum, it's probably conditioned the punters to expect overly consistent programming. Highly processed audio doesn't disturb anybody. So as we can see from this slide, in its simplest form, dynamic range control systems measure the signal somehow, and they apply a smooth version of the resulting control signal to a variable gain element. The drawing shows feed forward, but feedback, so the gain element on the other side, is also common. In any event, the result is a permanent change to the audio. It's measured, it's changed, that's the end. If you compare the result to the original, you're going to hear a difference. So, might make a consumer happy, probably not going to make a producer happy. Splitting the system into measuring before transmission, then applying afterwards is attractive because until fairly recently, consumer-side processing was fairly limited. DSPs were not big enough or powerful enough to do a full process on the consumer side. The bigger problem was sending full data rate audio and a full data rate control signal is hugely inefficient. It requires lots of data to get that through, and all for the purposes of improving quality. Not really a great sales tactic. So it seems that we're onto something. If we want to deliver the producer's vision without causing a crisp and ale disaster, loudness has to be controlled. We want to control the dynamic range, though, as well. It's got to be appropriate. Movie theater or even DVD-style dynamics are probably not appropriate for the typical living room. But really, we have a goal of preserving the original content. But if we break this apart and try to send the full bandwidth audio and a full bandwidth control signal, it's not practical. It's also not necessary. Remember metadata? This is the stuff that's been largely ignored as digital broadcast systems have rolled out. We've really tried. But the idea of having metadata start all the way at the point of production and make it through, it's just not realistic. I can almost sense the laughter in the room right now. We've really tried as an industry. It's just not practical. However, if we generate it in transmission, it can be better. Metadata is the stuff that can bridge the gap between the theory of this two-stage measure and apply dynamic range control system and the stark reality of trying to send all that data. So enter audio coding. Dolby Digital, Dolby Digital Plus, AAC and all its variants and offshoots, and other codecs have made provisions for audio data and this new thing called data about the audio data, or metadata. And these systems can carry it efficiently all the way to consumers. So now we have a slight variation on the two-stage approach. Same detection and control signal, but the audio is data reduced using psychoacoustic techniques, and the control signal is formatted to fit alongside the encoded audio data. So it fits all in a nice, small package. A single stream is delivered to consumers. After reception, the audio is decoded and the control signal is applied, or not. By default, though, control is applied. Consumers can choose to apply it, not apply it somewhere in between. Sadly, this choice can be maddeningly buried in the myriad controls of a home theater system, sometimes called midnight mode, sometimes called something else, sometimes not called anything at all. The one thing we can rely on is that the DRC subsystem, the dynamic range control subsystem, is a mandatory requirement for systems such as Dolby Digital and Dolby Digital Plus. They're tested that way. They don't get to put the logo on unless they are performing to specification. Since the decode side is relatively simple compared to the encode side, inclusion hasn't ever been a burden, and the results are reliably deployed. Millions and millions of consumers have this without even knowing it. There's definitely work to be done with consumer manufacturers and how these controls are exposed to consumers, but for now that's really beyond the codec. So why then is it still messy? To be honest, I believe it's related to what I lovingly call the evil five. And I'm going to mention these and everybody's going to know what I'm talking about. Film light, film standard, music light, music standard, and speech. Yes, these are better known as the dynamic range control profiles built into Dolby Digital encoders. They were developed primarily for DVD mastering, but arguably they're not quite as useful for broadcast. They all purposefully rely on consistent loudness at the input to the encoder, and they provide a nice big no-action zone that is sometimes wide enough to be ineffective. So you'll have dynamic range shifts and loudness shifts that sneak through. Thankfully, new techniques allow for well-known parameters like attack and release and ratio to be used in the creation of fully customized settings. Further, additional techniques allow fully hybrid control. All metadata, which means all reversible, so you can bypass the control and you can hear the original content, or all permanent, which means that the signal is permanently changed, And no matter what you do on the consumer side, it's still going to be controlled, and really anywhere in between. This permanence can be controlled by automation, new types of metadata. Metadata continues to evolve. The content itself, or even trusty old day parting. I almost made a mistake and wrote down crusty old day parting because it's been around as long as radio processing. What it is different degrees of processing at different times and on different days. So think about it. During prime time, for well-produced content, the dynamic range control can be fully reversible. At 4 o'clock in the morning, when somebody's trying to sell you a set of knives, there's no reason to have very much dynamic range that could be reversed. So putting permanent control on makes sense. Custom settings can also be generated upstream, so a producer can audition the results before the content is aired. But that sort of heads us back to what we've gotten out of, which is the entire metadata path from production all the way through to transmission. But the future gives us something to shoot for. We might end up there. The great thing is that everything we do in this domain is fully compatible with the huge universe of deployed decoders. A side benefit of using metadata is that multi-platform delivery can be satisfied without crippling the content. Imagine a piece of content that has to play back correctly on a mobile device. It'll sound great on a mobile device, but if you walk that device over to a home theater system, what was created to sound good through a 2mm speaker, now coming through a full range home theater system, is going to sound tiny and overcompressed. It's going to sound awful. Metadata allows the content to be tailored more closely to the device. So the original audio is kept the way it was created, and we use metadata to modify it. So it's simple. Dynamic range control is probably inevitable. Consumers have grown to expect smooth consistency, but accomplishing this does not have to permanently alter the content. One size absolutely does not fit all. For those of you who know who Mrs. Trellis from North Wales is, she wrote in, found out that I was going to be speaking today. Glad she's not here because she'd be disappointed that, I would hope she'd be disappointed that I'm not there in person. I explained to her that I was doing a presentation on television audio, and she said, you know, I'm familiar with this, I've seen it in the papers, and she said, I'm all for getting loudness problems out of television. And I said, Mrs. Trellis, I am too, but you know, let's try to tackle one thing at a time. We're talking about loudness. And she said, loudness? Haven't you all got that solved by now? It's a good point. We should have it solved by now. If Mrs. Trellis in North Wales can believe that it's solved by now, we can certainly do this, and we don't have to do it permanently. Before I go, I'd like to wish a happy Christmas to everybody, and to say that if anybody has any questions, you can't directly ask me, but Pete Wandless from Sound Network is in the audience. I think I see him over there. He's in the back right, hiding now that I'm mentioning his name. I'm sure he'd be happy to speak with you, or even after the event over a nice cold pint or three. Please also feel free to contact me by email. That's the best way. I can probably even respond to you right after this event. It's tim@linearacoustic.com. Again, Martin and Neil and Pete Wandless, thanks very much, and thanks everybody for attending.